Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. It is a great day, and this is an educational channel, and we take a look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and try to highlight them, show you their potential, what you can do with them to help out your life, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview. And today is our 531st video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson was an American engineer, and around 1959, he proposed his two fundamental postulates about how he believed the universe operated. And then through a process of deduction, he derived a theoretical universe, what his universe would look like if his postulates were correct. A lot of that was in chemistry and astronomy, and then he compared his theoretical findings with the experimental determinations of modern science. And, so we saw, looking at his book on chemistry, Basic Properties of Matter, how he was able to, in some sense, recreate scientific tables strictly from theory. He's able to come up with equations right out of his head, right out of his theory, that generated values for some of the basic properties of matter, such as the melting point and the specific heat and so on for various atoms and molecules that were strikingly accurate. But Larson didn't only write books on science. He does have books on chemistry and physics and astronomy, astrophysics, and but he also has a book on metaphysics where he delves into philosophy and religion and psychology and a little bit of biology. And some of his colleagues have written on meteorology and geology and archaeology, cryptoarchaeology. But Larson also wrote two books on economics. The microeconomic book is called The Road to Full Employment. And then the one we're looking at today, and have been looking at for the last couple weeks, is his macro book that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And so, we try to do broad coverage on this channel where we can take a look at Larson's theory kind of in its entirety, look at all of the different subjects that he covers and that his colleagues cover. And so we can get a sense of how to use Larson's theory, because it is a generalized theory. It's a theory that you can plug into every subject. And so certainly you must have some kind of pet subject that you would like to apply it to, that you would like to have more clarity about. And so we're trying to illuminate how to apply Larson's theory. Okay, now we are in chapter 5 of this book here called Concepts and Definitions. We started that yesterday, so, and again, you can go back about 2 weeks to get to the start of this book. Larson develops, he's trying to develop, this economic science, or what Ron Satz called econophysics. And he strikes that in contrast to the sociological economics of, most of the modern schools, the Keynesian and the John Kenneth Galbraiths, who are policymakers. They put together their economics based on politics, based on their, kind of ideological standpoints or perspectives. And Larson is really saying, well, that's all well and good, but you need to put together your economic system based on facts. Just like if you were building a bridge or a building, you might say, oh, this looks nice. I'd love to have a building that looks like this. But if it's not architecturally sound, if it doesn't comply with the laws of physics, you can have incredibly beautiful ideas in your head, but if they don't, if there isn't some science behind it, then the building is going to collapse or the bridge is going to collapse. It has to be sound. And so Larson is really looking at, putting into place sound economic policy based on facts. And, he cites probably the bedrock fact is that, the work or starve. You either work or you starve. And he abstracts it back to what he calls Robinson Crusoe economics, where you have economics of one person, to get to the nuts and bolts of it, the brass tacks of it. Now, just to give you a sense of Larson's theory, if you want to get any deeper into Larson's theory, you probably want to check out one of my earlier videos. Probably the first 474 of my videos goes a little bit more in depth about Larson's theory. I'm just going to explain it briefly right here. He's one of the few scientists to propose a universe based on motion. The universe is not made out of matter, not made out of energy, but it is made out of motion. And in particular, motion is what he calls a scalar motion. Scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude but has no specific direction. It's kind of like an internal motion or implicit motion, inherent motion. You can visualize that with a balloon that you put dots on. If you blow up the balloon, all the dots are moving away from each other. If you contract the balloon, all the dots are moving toward each other. But they're not moving in any specific direction. Every dot is moving in every direction, away from every other dot or toward every other dot. And it's really like the space itself, the fabric of the balloon is what's moving. Then also, motion for Larson is the relationship between space and time, which is a reciprocal relationship. Just like in your elementary school math class, your reciprocal, the reciprocal of 3 over 2 is 2 over 3, and so on. And for Larson, all of our scientific quantities are fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. So for example, speed. I was walking at 3 miles per hour. 3 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time is speed. If you double the speed, say I was power walking at 6 miles per hour, 6 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Or you can equivalently say that I was walking at 3 miles per half hour. that is the same. You can multiply the space or you can divide the time. And so Larson kind of plugs this into his theory of economics, this reciprocity. He just got done stating this here in chapter 5, that consumption is the reciprocal of production. So I think that's his starting point, where he's going to try to plug in his reciprocal relationship here. Production is the reciprocal of consumption. And in both cases, you're talking about goods, consumption of goods, production of goods, but that is also called purchasing power. So you have purchasing power on one hand when it's production, and goods on the other hand. Okay, now we're going to get right into about halfway through chapter 5, where he's talking about some more definitions here. On the foregoing basis, we have these definitions. Price is a value placed on goods for purposes of economic transactions. Seller's value is the minimum price that the owner of goods is willing to accept for them at a specific time and place. Buyer's value is the maximum price that an individual or agent is willing to pay for goods at a specific time or place. The cost of goods is the price paid to obtain them, or, if self-produced, the values expended in production. This brings us to the question, what determines value? On first consideration, it might seem that utility is the primary criterion. Since the aim of all economic activity is satisfaction of wants, and utility, as herein defined, is that property of goods by which they are able to supply such satisfactions, it can hardly be denied that measurement of utility also measures the total results obtained from economic activity. But for present purposes, we are not interested in the sum total of the material satisfactions that are realized. What we want to know is the size of that portion of the total that takes part in economic life. The portion of the utilities that, in the modern economies, can be bought and sold in the markets. Although inherently subjective, value, as we have defined it, has a definite relation to utility, an objective property. In order that there may be value, the individual concerned must believe that there is some utility to him, either directly or because of the possibility of exchange for other goods that he can utilize. It is not necessary that any actual utility exist, nor does the existence of utility automatically result in the existence of value. The essential requirement is a belief in the existence of utility. Many ineffective medicines have value because there are those who think that they are being helped by these concoctions and therefore willing to buy them. On the other hand, anthracite coal had no value until someone discovered that it would burn. The perceived utility of economic goods is a factor in determining their value because it affects the individual's willingness to make the expenditure that is necessary in order to obtain them. An equally important factor is his ability to pay the price. In Crusoe's situation, the limiting factor is physical, his capacity for productive labor. If he finds it impossible to work more than an average of 10 hours per day, then his average consumption of goods cannot exceed the equivalent of 10 hours labor. When we examine some particular item, such as the maintenance of comfortable temperatures in his house, we can see that both ability and willingness enter into the determination of the value of firewood. Part of Crusoe's time must be spent in obtaining the necessities of life, and these items must be given precedence over the comforts. If half of his total labor is required for such purposes, the factor of ability limits him to 5 hours per day for obtaining firewood. But Crusoe is not willing to spend all of his time to obtain warmth, to the exclusion of all other non-essential objectives. And we will find that he sets a lower figure, perhaps something on the order of 8 hours per week, as a maximum. If it requires more time than this to maintain a supply of firewood, he will accept the discomfort of a cold house and apply his labor elsewhere. We thus find that whereas cost may vary almost without bound, value has an upper limit. If the cost of production is above this limiting value, which we will call the potential value to emphasize the analogy with potential utility, these particular goods are not produced or bought. The difference between this concept of potential value and the value concept that economists call value in use is in this limit imposed by a finite ability to pay. Like cost, quote, value in use has no upper limit. It is this concept of value, that's the end of the quote. It is this concept of value to which Joseph Schumpeter refers when he says that, quote, total value will very often be infinitely large. But this value has no economic significance, and bringing it into an economic discussion merely confuses the issues. Willingness to buy means nothing without ability to buy. It should be noted that this limitation imposed by inability to pay any higher price is always effective, even in the case of the absolute necessities of life. The potential value of these necessities, food, for example, is relatively high, but it is still finite, not infinite as Schumpeter claims, because no matter how willing an individual may be to pay whatever price is necessary to sustain life, there is always a point at which he is no longer able to pay more. This is the potential value, and if the cost of food exceeds this level, by definition of value to a particular individual and at a particular time, this individual and those dependent on him must starve, unless others come to their assistance, even though there is food somewhere which he could obtain if he were able to place a greater economic value upon it, that is, pay a higher price. We may deplore this situation, but it exists, and it is the function of economic science to analyze things as they are, not as we would like them to be, or as we think they ought to be. The potential value is the maximum amount which an individual is willing and able to spend to obtain a particular economic product, if necessary. But ordinarily, this great an expenditure is not required, and the actual value, the amount which he is willing to spend under the existing circumstances, is determined by those factors which make the maximum expenditure unnecessary. The first of these factors is the price at which similar goods are available. A certain article may have a potential value of $10 to the prospective purchaser, but if an equivalent article can be bought for $1 elsewhere in the same general market, then the actual value of the article in question cannot exceed $1. A second determinant of actual value is substitutability. On first consideration, it may seem absurd to say that the value of oats is determined largely by the cost of wheat, one naturally expects value to be a characteristic of the commodity itself, on the order of density, viscosity, or some such physical property. Potential utility, as we have defined it, is such a property, an inherent characteristic of the goods. But value, potential or actual, is not. Except in the limiting situation where no acceptable substitute is available, value, in the sense in which the term is used in this work, is dependent to a very large degree on the cost of possible substitutes. Summarizing the foregoing, we find that potential value is determined by A, utility, and B, ability to buy or produce. Actual value is determined by A, seller's offers or minimum production costs, and B, availability and cost of substitutes, and C, potential value as a limiting factor. In an exchange economy, the cost of production does not enter into the determination of values directly, but it does so indirectly through the seller's offers. That is, sellers will not continue to offer products at less than the cost of production. Whenever a deliberate economic choice is made, the decision as to what goods to buy or produce depends on the ratio of potential value to cost. How much value we get for our money, as the layman puts it. The most essential wants are satisfied first because the value-cost ratio is highest there. Indeed, nothing else has any value until the necessities of life are provided for. This fact that less essential items may have little value, or perhaps no value at all, in spite of having considerable utility, is one of the peculiarities of the value situation that is much easier to understand when we look at it in the context of the simple economy. Let us consider the case of an isolated person whose entire time is required for the production of the bare essentials of life, either because his environment is unfavorable or because he is personally inefficient. To this individual, nothing outside of these essentials has any value, as herein defined, since however willing he may be to produce it, he is not able to do so. Luxuries would still have utility, of course, and if there were any way of getting them without effort, he would be glad to have them. But he cannot devote any time to producing them, or to producing anything else that he can exchange for them. For if he does this, he ceases to exist. Now let us turn our attention to another individual whose productivity is 50% greater. In this case, only 2/3 of the total available labor time is required for producing the bare essentials, and the balance can be applied to improving the scale of living. Here, comforts and conveniences begin to have a value. A third individual whose productivity is 100% greater than the first would be able to assign a still greater value to these luxuries. That is, he would be not only willing but also able to devote more of his labor to their production or acquisition. In general, we may say that the greater the productivity, the higher the value that can be placed on non-necessities. This is one of the places where scientific conclusions are distressing to some persons. Many economists and laymen wax highly indignant over the ability of persons with larger incomes to enjoy the good things of life that are denied to those not so fortunately situated. and they object to any kind of a terminology which might imply some justification for the state of affairs. They tell us that the wants of the poor are equally as strong as those of the rich, and that consequently values are the same to all. But this is merely confusing value with utility. The utility of some goods may be the same to all, but in order to analyze economic processes, we must have a concept that takes into account ability to pay the cost as well as desire to enjoy the goods. This does not imply either approval or disapproval of the existing situation, which requires the use of such a concept. It is simply a recognition of the facts. The value which most of us are able to place upon a yacht or an original Rembrandt has no economic significance, and nothing is gained by pretending that it does. In this connection, it is interesting to note that the distinction between utility and value is recognized even by animals of presumably low intelligence. Notwithstanding the fact that some of our savants manage to get them gloriously tangled up when they attempt to harmonize them with their own emotional judgments. The hungry cat will catch mice if there is no other kind of food available, but he will not put forth the effort if a tender-hearted mistress is susceptible to some artful begging. The utility of mice as food is just as great in one case as in the other, but in feline economic life, as well as in human economic life, cost is compared with value, not with utility, and in accordance with the principles that have been set forth in the preceding discussion, the value of mice as food is decreased by the availability of acceptable substitutes at a lower cost. As already noted, one of the principal determinants of buyer's value is the price at which the same goods can be obtained elsewhere in the same general market. Under some circumstances, sellers may offer limited quantities of particular items at abnormally low prices, especially if these goods are perishable. But they cannot continue to sell at a price below the cost of production. Under normal conditions, the minimum price of any particular kind of goods is therefore the lowest cost at which any producer can produce them and transport them on the market to the market area. It follows that the amount of these goods available for sale at this price in this market, the supply, is limited to the optimum output of this one producer. If a somewhat higher price could be obtained, additional producers would be able to enter the market, and the original supplier might also be able to increase his output. It follows that the supply at this higher price would be greater. A still higher price would still further increase the supply. Thus, the supply of a particular kind of goods in a market is not a specific quantity, but a series of quantities, a schedule, as it is usually called, corresponding to a similar series of prices. The supply of an economic good in a specific market at a specific time is a schedule indicating the amount of that good which will be offered for sale at different prices. As indicated in Chapter 4, the buyer's value placed on goods by individuals must be above the seller's price in order to enable a transaction to take place. At the minimum price, the seller's value, the number of consumers whose value estimate is above this price is usually relatively large. The quantity that the consumer would buy at this price, the demand for these goods is therefore also relatively large. At a higher price, some of the consumers find that the price now exceeds the value that they have placed on the goods as buyers. Consequently, they do not buy them. A still higher price takes additional consumers out of the market. Thus, the demand generally decreases as the price rises. The demand for an economic good in a specific market at a specific time is a schedule indicating the amount of that good which will be bought at different prices. In each case, there is only one price at which supply and demand are equal. This is the only price that will clear the market, and it is therefore the price at which the transactions take place. Changes in either supply or demand result in corresponding changes in the market price. The supply and demand relationships have been extensively investigated by the economists and are well covered in the economic literature. There is, however, a strong tendency to apply supply and demand reasoning to issues that are outside its range of applicability. It is not too much to say, contends one enthusiast, that almost everything we know about the behavior of the economic system can be illuminated by way of reference to the fundamental cross of demand and supply. But this is too much to say, far too much. The truth is that supply and demand theory does not illuminate all areas in economics. On the contrary, it has contributed greatly to the confusion that now exists in several important economic areas, particularly such subjects as the origin and magnitude of the total demand for goods and the true significance of the money supply. The reasons for the inapplicability of the supply and demand principles to these issues will be discussed in connection with the examination of the individual issues in the subsequent pages. Okay, that is the end of the chapter. Now, the next chapter, chapter 6, is called The Money Economy. And I think Larson gets into a lot of the meat of his work right here in chapter 6, which we will start tomorrow when we resume. So thank you for tuning in today, and have a great